Hello, and welcome to Metabolic Syndrome Nutrition Tips to Lower Your Risk. My name is Lauren, and I'm a registered dietitian with Rock Valley Health. Here today to tell you all about metabolic syndrome and help you determine your risk so that you can lower your numbers and learn about how you can lower them through a variety of dietary and lifestyle changes. So throughout the whole video today, there will be a few different knowledge breaks for you to test your knowledge with a variety of questions, which will be part of the quiz after this video. So let's get started. So first off, we want to know, what is metabolic syndrome? Metabolic syndrome is a group of 5 risk factors that ultimately determine your risk for chronic diseases, for things like heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, and certain cancers. And if you have 3 or more of these 5 risk factors, you are at an increased risk for these chronic diseases. So your risk for metabolic syndrome is usually measured at your doctor's office, or if you do a health screening with us as part of Rock Valley Health. So first off, defining those 5 risk factors that we look at for metabolic syndrome. The first is high blood pressure. If your blood pressure at resting is greater than 130/85, the second is high fasting glucose, or also known as your blood sugar, if this is greater than or equal to 100 if you have been fasting for at least 12 hours. Also, if your fasting triglycerides are high, this is a measurement of fat in your bloodstream, and if this is greater than or equal to 150, that is a metabolic syndrome risk factor as well. Next one is your low HDL cholesterol. This is your good cholesterol. So if this number is low, less than 40 for men and less than 50 for women, that counts as another risk factor. As well as the last one is high waist circumference. So if your waist circumference is greater than or equal to 40 inches for men and greater than or equal to 35 inches for women, that is a risk factor. But again, if you just have 1 or 2 of these risk factors, that doesn't qualify you for metabolic syndrome. But if you have 3 or more of these risk factors, then you fall into that metabolic syndrome category, which puts you at increased risk for chronic disease. So, why is it important that you should know your risk for metabolic syndrome? So, your risk for metabolic syndrome, if you fall into having at least 3 of those 5 risk factors that we just talked about, you are at double the risk for heart disease and 5 times more likely to develop type 2 diabetes. And it's really important to note that you won't necessarily experience any symptoms. Even if you have all 5 of those risk factors that we've talked about, you won't necessarily have any symptoms that will be an outright sign that you do have metabolic syndrome. So it's really important that we lower your risk for metabolic syndrome, get these numbers checked regularly so we can ultimately decrease your risk for chronic disease and increase your longevity. And it is important to note the most common risk factors that contribute to metabolic syndrome risk is actually being overweight or obese, which is a BMI or body mass index of greater than 25, as well as a lack of regular and consistent physical activity. All right, so our first knowledge break here, first question that I want you to think about is, which of the following is not a risk factor for metabolic syndrome? Is it A, total cholesterol, B, HDL cholesterol, C, triglycerides, D, glucose or blood sugar, and E, waist circumference? And our second question for our second knowledge break here, what is the most common symptom of metabolic syndrome? A, fatigue or lack of energy. B, stomach pains or gastrointestinal irregularity. C, chest pain. D, being overweight or obese. And E, none of the above. So those are just a couple questions for you to think about that'll be part of your post video questionnaire. All right, so moving on to that first metabolic syndrome risk factor of high blood pressure. So, like I mentioned earlier, if your resting blood pressure is greater than 130/85, this is a metabolic syndrome risk factor. The recommended range for a healthy blood pressure is less than 120/80. And if your blood pressure is high, this can cause extra strain on your heart and clogged arteries, which can actually weaken your heart muscle and which can actually lead to heart failure. And this ultimately increases your risk for stroke, dementia, and kidney failure. And also, chronic stress and smoking can also increase blood pressure. All right, so moving on to that first. So, what dietary changes can you make to lower your blood pressure? The biggest dietary change that you can make is to be mindful of your salt or sodium intake. Your daily goal should be less than 2,300 milligrams per day. So, things that you could do to help lower your salt intake is try not to use the salt shaker at home or when you're eating out. Also, minimizing those fast foods and fried foods. Things like convenient frozen meals and frozen pizzas are also notorious for having really high sodium content. Another easy thing you can do to swap out your salt is choosing low sodium canned vegetables and low sodium soups and broths. And also, my kind of dietitian tip is if you are choosing those frozen convenience meals, looking on that nutrition label for around 25% or less of sodium. That's kind of a healthy benchmark to look for those. All right, so our third knowledge break here about lowering blood pressure. What changes can you make to lower your blood pressure? A, minimize your fast food intake. B, choose lower sodium canned vegetables or broths. C, manage chronic stress. D, don't use the salt shaker. Or E, all of the above. All right, and then moving on to our second metabolic syndrome risk factor, high fasting glucose or high blood sugar. So, if you have been fasting for at least 12 hours, this indicator of metabolic syndrome is if it's greater than or equal to 100. So, if you have a blood sugar, fasting blood sugar that's higher than 100, it's a sign of possible insulin resistance, which can actually lead to kidney and blood vessel damage over time. And so you may be thinking, what is insulin? What's insulin resistance? So, insulin is actually a hormone that's produced by your pancreas to help manage your blood sugar levels. So, it's kind of your body's natural way of helping to manage your blood sugar. And so, if we're looking at risk for diabetes here, if your fasting blood sugar is between 100 and 125, that's more of the pre diabetes range. We see that a lot with people who have just a little bit of a family history of diabetes. And then more the diabetes category for your fasting blood sugar. If that is greater than 125, that is getting more into that diabetes category. And also, you may have heard of your A1C. If you are diabetic or pre diabetic or have a family history of diabetes, your doctor might check that for you every 3 to 6 months, once a year, because it's basically a 2 to 3 month average of your blood sugar levels. So, more of a long term indicator of your diabetes risk. Um, and so it's a lot more of a long term picture, whereas that fasting blood sugar is just kind of a one time snapshot of your fasting blood sugar, where the A1C number kind of tracks how your blood sugar has been controlled over a 2 to 3 month period. And so, normal range for that is recommended to be less than 5.7%. Anywhere from 5.7 to 6.4% is getting into that pre-diabetes range, and then greater than 6.5 is more into that diabetes risk category. All right, so what dietary changes can you make to improve your fasting blood sugar and your overall diabetes risk? So the biggest thing to focus on here is minimizing added sugar. Things like desserts and sweets, obviously, sugary beverages. There's a lot of hidden sources of sugar out there that we don't think about all the time. So it's really important to be mindful of those added sugars. And added sugars are actually listed separately under total sugars on the nutrition label now. So it's kind of really easy to find that number. And for most people, if you're eating a regular 2,000 calorie diet, we want to be 50 grams or less of added sugars in a day. So that's kind of a good benchmark to remember for that when you're looking at those labels. And then also you want to minimize your intake of those processed refined carbohydrates, things like white breads and pastas and baked goods. Trying to just limit those overall. And also just trying to incorporate, maybe swap those refined carbohydrates out for more healthy sources of carbohydrates. So a lot of people don't realize fruits, vegetables, low fat dairy products, in addition to all those grain products, those actually have natural healthy carbohydrates. So try to get more fruits, veggies, low fat dairy products, beans, and whole grains into our diet is really what we want to focus on to keep your blood sugar level healthy. And so whole grains, those are things to look for that say whole wheat or whole grain either on the ingredient list or on the front of the packaging somewhere. So doing whole wheat or whole grain breads or pastas is a really easy swap out you can do for that, as well as brown rice instead of white rice. And then things like oatmeal and popcorn are also whole grain products. And then another important thing to note for improving your fasting blood sugar is to make sure that you're actually eating at consistent intervals throughout the day. This supports healthy blood sugar control because ultimately, if you go all day without eating and then eat a huge meal at the end of the day, your blood sugar is just really low throughout the day, and then it causes a huge spike at the end of the day. And so, if you're doing things like that consistently, it's not the greatest for your blood sugar control. So long-term periods between eating occasions can cause those large changes in blood sugar, and that can negatively impact your fasting blood sugar level over time. So that's when, if you think you might struggle with eating consistently throughout the day, that's kind of where we might see a borderline kind of fasting blood sugar. All right, so our question number 4 here for our next knowledge break is what dietary changes can you make to lower your fasting blood sugar? A, consume less whole grain products. B, eat larger meals and snacks throughout the day. C, minimize your intake of added sugars and processed carbohydrates. Or D, don't eat too much fruit because these are higher in sugar. All right, so moving on to our third risk factor here, high triglycerides. So fasting, if your triglycerides are greater than or equal to 150, puts you into that risk factor category for this aspect of metabolic syndrome. And triglycerides are just the measurement of fat in your bloodstream. So high levels can contribute to hardening of your arteries and just overall a negative effect on your heart health. So, what dietary changes can you make to lower those triglycerides? The biggest thing here, minimizing those fast foods and those fried foods, minimizing things like processed, prepackaged snack foods, and then desserts and sweets. So, just eating less processed foods in general is the goal here. And you also want to try choosing healthy, unsaturated fats. So, things you can do here to minimize um, those unhealthy fats but have more unsaturated healthy fats is swapping out red meat for leaner meats like chicken or turkey, or buying a little bit higher percent lean ground beef, incorporating more fish or seafood in your diet, cooking with olive oil versus butter, and also eating more nuts and nut butters. And also for triglycerides, you want to watch your alcohol intake too. This can be another dietary change that can directly impact those triglyceride levels. So for men, sticking to 2 drinks or less per day, and then for women, sticking to 1 drink or less per day. All right, so next question here. What dietary changes can you make to lower your fasting triglycerides? A, eat more saturated fats. B, eat more red meat. C, eat more trans fats. Or D, eat more unsaturated fats, minimize fast food and alcohol intake. All right, moving on to our next metabolic syndrome risk factor, low HDL cholesterol. So, this is a risk factor if your fasting value for HDL cholesterol is less than 40 for men and less than 50 for women. So, we actually want this number to be higher. It is also called your good cholesterol because it provides extra protective benefits for your heart. And it actually helps remove excess bad cholesterol in your bloodstream. So, not all cholesterol levels are bad. So this is the good cholesterol that we want to focus on. So what dietary changes can you specifically make to increase your HDL cholesterol? So this is similar to the triglyceride recommendation. You want to increase your intake of those healthier unsaturated fats plus omega-3 fats. So things like seafood, nuts and nut butters, olive oil versus butter, avocados are a really great source of healthy fat. Omega-3 eggs are also out there on the market as an easy addition for those healthy fats. And also plant-based sources like chia seeds and flax seeds. These are things that you can add into a lot of different things, smoothies, yogurt. It's in a lot of granolas and cereals too. And also, I always like to give the dietitian recommendation if you don't like seafood or you don't think you consume enough of those healthy fats regularly, I would recommend considering to choose an omega-3 or a fish oil supplement. This is something that if you're taking daily over the long term, it can help increase your HDL cholesterol. All right, so next question, next knowledge break here is what dietary supplement is recommended to help increase your HDL cholesterol? Is it A, collagen, B, omega-3 or fish oil, C, is it those fat soluble vitamins, vitamin A, D, E, and K, or is it fiber supplements, things like Metamucil or Benefiber? All right, so moving on to the last risk factor here is high waist circumference. So this is a risk factor we look at for metabolic syndrome. If your waist circumference is greater than or equal to 40 inches for men and greater than or equal to 35 inches for women. We take the waist circumference into account because excess weight in your abdominal area can increase your risk even more for things like chronic disease and premature death. And having a larger waist circumference, this measurement is actually a little bit more important of a risk factor versus weight overall and body mass index, which is just a ratio of your height to your weight or your body fat percentage, just because of the amount of research and evidence that is out there showing that the more excess weight you have, specifically around your abdominal area, can increase your risk factor for more significant chronic disease. And a lot of people don't realize that your actual waist circumference, what we measure for you if you do a health screening with us, is just right above your belly button. More of your natural waist is a little bit higher than you think, and it's not actually the same as your usual pant size. All right. So, what dietary and lifestyle changes can you make to improve your overall waist circumference? So, a big thing that I like to recommend as a registered dietitian is practicing what's called mindful eating. A lot of people may or may not have heard of this, but it's really just learning what your natural hunger and fullness cues are. So, it's really helpful to just really pause and slow down during your meals. Everyone is just so busy and on the go these days, they don't really take the time to stop and check in with themselves to think, am I actually hungry? Do I need to be eating right now? Or do I actually feel full? Should I stop eating right now? Because that's really where a lot of those excess, unwanted, and unneeded calories can come in. So taking mindful eating into account is a big thing to focus on, as well as incorporating healthy portion sizes. I always encourage my clients to use measuring cups at home for those recommended serving sizes that are on the labels for things like cereal or things that you might be serving over serving yourself a little bit if your eyes are bigger than your stomach and you might not know what the actual serving size is. So using measuring cups to look at the serving on the nutrition labels to actually kind of know what a healthful serving is and not overdoing it on the calories there. And a lot of people don't know a healthy serving size for pasta is actually the size of your fist or a baseball. And then for any kind of protein, any meat, it's really a healthy serving size is the size of a palm of your hand or the size of a deck of cards. The next thing that you can do to improve your waist circumference, really focusing on increasing fiber and protein. Both of these contribute to what's called satiety, which is a feeling of fullness. So, sources of fiber that we should focus on are things like fruits and vegetables, beans, and those whole grains. Things that we talked about that can help with your blood sugar control as well, doing those whole grains instead of the white, starchy, refined grains. Protein sources include things like lean meat, eggs, nuts and nut butters, low fat dairy products, and then there are convenient products like protein bars and protein powders out there. My recommendation for those is just really watching the added sugars that are in those products and be mindful to make sure they have a little bit of fiber in them as well to make it kind of a well-rounded nutrition source there. And so, if you're not consistently eating what I call nutrient dense foods that are rich in fiber and protein, you're going to likely be hungrier throughout the day because these are more calorie dense foods like the snack foods, the desserts and sweets. Those are really calorie dense, but they're not very nutrient dense. They don't have many vitamins and minerals. They don't have a lot of fiber and protein to help keep us full throughout the day. So, if you're eating more calorie dense, less nutrient dense foods, that can cause more eating occasions throughout the day and ultimately lead to more excess calories and more unwanted weight gain. All right, so I always give the recommendation too of a healthy weight loss timeline is actually just 1 to 2 pounds per week. You might actually think that that's not really a lot, um, but it is kind of a slow and steady timeline of what we want to focus on for a healthy weight loss that you can keep off for a long period of time. So really paying attention to how your clothes are fitting, your energy levels. These are non-weight indicators of healthy weight loss as well. I always recommend not getting too worked up about that number on the scale because healthy weight loss is again more of that slow and steady timeline that we want to focus on. And also consistent physical activity. That's going to be kind of a calorie deficit, creating more of a boost to create that overall calorie deficit that we want for weight loss to help minimize that waist circumference. So 30 minutes, 5 days per week of moderate intensity exercise is what's recommended. And I always encourage finding activities that you enjoy, doing them with a friend or a family member, and trying to plan them out in your weekly schedule like you would anything else to make sure that you stay consistent. All right, so question number 7, our last knowledge break here. What dietary and lifestyle changes can you make to lower your waist circumference and ultimately decrease your metabolic syndrome risk? Is it A, start a low carbohydrate diet? B, have a goal to lose 5 pounds each week? C, practice mindful eating and incorporate healthy portion sizes? Or D, increase time between eating occasions to create a calorie deficit? All right, so that comes to the end of our metabolic syndrome overview. I hope you guys learned a lot of different things about how you can ultimately decrease your risk for metabolic syndrome, decrease your risk for chronic disease, and ultimately increase your overall health and wellness. So, thanks for watching. Next, you guys will be able to test your knowledge with those questions that we went over in a post video quiz.